Maya Brooks watched her control panel explode in sparks as the small research vessel shuddered violently around her, and the proximity alarm screamed warnings. She already understood too well because something had torn through the engine core, and now she had maybe 60 seconds before the whole ship became a fireball drifting through space. Her fingers flew across the emergency systems, and she thanked every deity she could remember that the escape pod still showed green lights because, without it, she would die here alone in uncharted space where nobody would ever find her remains or know what happened to the engineer who had volunteered for this solo mapping mission. The pod bay doors opened with a grinding sound that made her heart skip, and she threw herself into the cramped capsule just as another explosion rocked the vessel and sent her tumbling against the far wall hard enough to see stars. But she slapped the launch button anyway because staying meant certain death, and at least the pod gave her a chance. The acceleration crushed her into the seat as the pod rocketed away from the dying ship and through the tiny viewport. She watched her vessel break apart in silent flames that looked almost beautiful against the darkness of space. And then she was spinning toward the green and blue planet below with no control and no idea what waited on the surface. The pod's heat shield glowed red as atmosphere caught her, and the whole world became fire and noise and violent shaking that rattled her teeth and made her bite her tongue until she tasted copper. But the automated systems held and deployed the chutes at exactly the right moment to keep her from becoming a crater. Maya hit the ground in a forest of towering purple trees with trunks as thick as buildings, and she lay there for a long moment just breathing and marveling that she still could breathe because the air tasted strange, but not toxic, and gravity felt only slightly heavier than Earth standard, which meant this planet could support human life at least temporarily. She climbed out on shaky legs and took stock of her situation with the methodical thinking that had made her a good engineer because panic solved nothing, and she needed solutions, not fear. The pod had basic supplies for 2 weeks and a distress beacon that might reach a patrol ship if one happened to pass within range, but her vessel had been far off established routes, which meant rescue could take months or might never come at all. A sound made her freeze, and she turned slowly to see figures emerging from between the massive trees, and her first thought was that they looked almost human, except they stood at least 7 feet tall with skin that shimmered silver in the dappled light and eyes that glowed amber like a predator's in darkness. The lead figure carried a weapon that looked like a spear, but crackled with energy, and she wore armor made of overlapping scales that might have been metal, or might have been something organic, and her face held an expression Maya could not read, but suspected meant danger. Maya raised her hands slowly in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace, because fighting was pointless when she stood 5'4" against warriors who towered over her and looked like they could break her in half without effort. The leader spoke in a language of clicks and melodic tones that meant nothing to Maya, but the tone seemed more curious than hostile, which she chose to take as a positive sign, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. She pointed to herself and said her name clearly, and then pointed to the sky where her ship had burned and made a gesture she hoped conveyed crash and accident and helplessness. The leader tilted her head in a way that reminded Maya of a bird studying an insect, and then spoke again in that incomprehensible language, before gesturing with her weapon toward the forest in what seemed like a command. Maya had no choice but to follow as the warriors surrounded her and led her deeper into the alien forest, where the trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated, and strange creatures called from the canopy above, with sounds like song mixed with static. They walked for what felt like hours before the forest opened onto a settlement that took Maya's breath away, because the buildings rose in organic spirals of stone and metal that seemed to grow from the earth itself, and everything hummed with energy she could feel in her bones. The warriors brought her to a large structure at the center of the settlement, and inside she found herself in a hall where more of the tall aliens gathered and stared at her with those unsettling amber eyes. Leader who had found her stepped forward and removed her helmet, and Maya saw delicate features that might have been beautiful by any species standards and hair that fell in a cascade of silver down her back. She spoke, and this time another alien stepped forward with a device that had pointed at Maya, and after a moment the device made sounds that resolved into words Maya could almost understand. The translation was rough, but she gathered that her name was Zira, and she commanded this settlement, and wanted to know what Maya was and where she came from and whether she posed a threat. Maya explained as simply as she could about Earth and humans and her mission to map distant systems and the accident that had destroyed her ship, and she emphasized that she meant no harm and only wanted to survive until rescue came. Zira listened with an intensity that made Maya nervous, and then she spoke words the translator rendered as something like, "You are very small and weak, and I wonder if you are worth the resources to keep alive." The blunt assessment stung, but Maya kept her face neutral because showing offense would accomplish nothing, and she needed these people to let her live. She said, "I may be small, but I am an engineer, and I can build and repair things, and perhaps I can be useful to you in exchange for shelter." And Fudzera's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement, and she gestured around the hall at the technology that surrounded them and said, "We have engineers, and what could someone so tiny possibly know that we do not?" Maya felt desperation claw at her throat because if she could not prove her value, they might simply leave her to die in the wilderness. But then she noticed the lights flickering in a pattern that suggested power fluctuation, and she saw scorch marks on some of the walls that indicated electrical problems. She pointed and said, "Your power grid is failing, and I can see the stress patterns in your lighting systems and the thermal damage to your conduits, and if you give me access, I can diagnose the problem and possibly fix it." Zira followed her gesture, and her eyes narrowed, and she exchanged words with another warrior whose armor bore different markings and who looked at Maya with open skepticism. The skeptical one spoke, and the translator called her Kira, and rendered her words as, "Our own engineers have tried for weeks and failed, and you claim you can succeed where they could not." Maya met her gaze steadily and said, "Different perspectives solve different problems, and human engineering approaches might see what yours have missed. And besides, what do you have to lose by letting me try?" Zira considered this, and finally nodded and spoke commands that sent warriors hurrying to obey. And soon Maya found herself led to a massive chamber deep underground where generators hummed and power conduits snaked across walls like veins. The alien engineers watched her with suspicion as she examined their systems, but she ignored them and focused on the problem because this was what she knew and what she was good at, and her life depended on proving it. She traced the power flow and checked connections and measured output levels with tools from her pod, and slowly, the problem revealed itself because their system ran on a resonance principle that was brilliant, but unstable and small. Harmonic interference was cascading through the network, causing the fluctuations. The fix required retuning the resonance frequency and adding dampeners at key points, and she worked for hours, while the alien engineers watched and occasionally offered tools or information through the translator device. When she finally activated the modified system, the light steadied and the hum of the generators smoothed into a perfect tone, and she saw surprise and something like respect flash across the faces of her observers. Zira arrived to inspect the work, and she studied the steady lights and the calm readouts, and then she looked at Maya with new assessment in those amber eyes. She said, "You have done what our people could not, and perhaps you are more than you appear to be, and you may stay here until your rescue comes." Maya felt relief wash through her, but before she could, respond alarms began blaring and warriors rushed through the corridors shouting warnings, and Zira's expression hardened into something fierce. Through the translator, Maya understood that another clan was attacking and raids were common, but this seemed larger than usual, and Zira commanded her people to defensive positions with the confidence of someone who had led many battles. Maya followed Zira toward the surface, and from the settlement's edge, she saw figures emerging from the forest, and they looked similar to Zira's people but wore different armor and carried weapons that glowed with menacing light. The battle began with shocking speed and violence, and Maya pressed herself against a wall as energy weapons discharged and warriors clashed with strength that would have killed a human instantly. She watched Zira fight with brutal efficiency and grace, and saw how outmatched the defenders were because the attackers had greater numbers and were pushing toward the power station that Maya had just repaired. Desperation sparked an idea, and she ran back to her pod and grabbed the emergency toolkit, because human ships carried defensive systems, and while they were designed